Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Pond's mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 44. Today we are delighted to be joined by author and journalist Andrew Lycett to talk about his latest book, The Worlds of Sherlock Holmes. Andrew has written a number of well-received biographies of mainly literary figures, including Ian Fleming, Dylan Thomas, Wilkie Collins, Rudyard Kipling, and of course, Arthur Conan Doyle. His 2007 biography, Conan Doyle, the Man Who Created Sherlock Holmes, and his 2020 volume, Conan Doyle's Wide World, are essential reading for every self-respecting Doylean. His latest book, published by Francis Lincoln, is The Worlds of Sherlock Holmes, a lavishly illustrated examination of the social, political, and intellectual environment which spawned both Sherlock Holmes and his creator, Conan Doyle. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. And the first question from me is, you'll be well known to listeners of this podcast for your 2007 biography of Conan Doyle. How did you arrive at Doyle as a subject for biography?
Well, I'd done a handful of biographies before then. Basically what happened was that I'd done a biography of Rudyard Kipling. And he was roughly of the same era as Conan Doyle, and I was interested in following up on that to an extent. I was fascinated by the story of when Conan Doyle went to the United States in 1894 to sort of promote himself, having actually at that stage abandoned Sherlock Holmes. He met up with Kipling, and they were sort of two British authors in North America, two British authors with quite a sort of wide understanding of the world, and that interested me. And actually, at that time, when I'd just done my Kipling biography, which was something like 1999, I think, I did approach the Conan Doyle estate about doing a biography of Conan Doyle. Indeed. It was at a time when they didn't really want to engage on that, and I kind of understand why. It was they were sort of bringing the estate to fruition, because that became clear in 2004 when all the sort of documents and photographs and everything associated with this estate were put up for sale at Christie's, and that was 2004, and that was a magnificent occasion. I mean, not saying that they got rid of everything, because I believe they didn't, but there was a significant amount of material, manuscripts, and particularly letters between Conan Doyle and his mother, and this sparked me again. I mean, I hadn't given up on the idea, but this sparked me again to sort of get out there and make the connection with the Conan Doyle estate. They didn't say don't go ahead. It was a difficult time for them, because it was, as you probably know, was sort of the time when the unfortunate death of Richard Lonsdale Green, and but nevertheless, there was a scope for a new biography of Conan Doyle, and it's not a subject that hasn't been done before by any chance. But I was able to look at these papers that were in the sale at Christie's, which were a lot of them were bought by the British Library, and also they were bought by collectors, largely in the United States, but they proved very amenable to my looking at them, and they were very kind, basically, and very supportive. I thought I would be able to bring a new approach to Conan Doyle's life, and my book duly came out 3 years later, 2007, as you already said.
Yeah. And it's an astonishing achievement as well. I mean, I've been very lucky to be in the British Library at times and look through some of those same letters. There's nothing quite like going back to the original source material like that. And
absolutely, and there's so much. I mean, I just say the letters, but there's diaries, and not totally comprehensive, but it just gives you a nice, and also some of the lesser figures that Conan Doyle associated with, but add colour to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we should really talk about this your new book today, which is
true, yeah.
which is the World of Sherlock Holmes, and it is a fascinating read.
Worlds.
The worlds of Sherlock Holmes, the worlds of Sherlock Holmes, and it's a fascinating read. I mean, it's a grand survey of this incredible period of change that spawned both Conan Doyle and obviously Sherlock Holmes, and you managed to achieve a balance throughout this book between the sort of life of Conan Doyle on the one hand and the fiction of Sherlock Holmes on the other. And I wondered, what was your intention going into the book, and how easy was it for you to achieve that kind of balance that you've managed to strike?
Well, it was an interesting new departure in some ways, because, as we've said, I'd done a number of biographies, including the one of Conan Doyle, and this was looking largely, looking in part anyway, at a fictional figure, which I hadn't done before. And but the job description was to do exactly what I've just emphasized, really. It was about the worlds of Sherlock Holmes. And it meant really the kind of all the things that went into making up this figure, incorporating both sort of imaginary worlds that he lived in, and also Conan Doyle's own world, which was well defined, because he was a sturdy figure who had his own presence in the world, but the way that they kind of interlinked and influenced each other. And there has been this fiction for quite some time that Sherlock Holmes's author or biographer was Dr. Watson, and that Conan Doyle was just the literary agent who brought these to publication. I think it's interesting, and you with your work, have sort of done quite a bit to bring Conan Doyle back into the picture, and I think that the general Sherlockian world is beginning to sort of tilt slightly. I don't know what your opinion about that is.
Yeah.
But, anyway, the point really being is that I wanted to explore that world. I mean, in very crude terms, it's the world, as the song says, the world of 1895. I mean, the first chapter that I really get into after an introduction is to do with the places that Sherlock Holmes inhabited, and indeed Conan Doyle, not exactly inhabited, but the way that Conan Doyle's travels in particular, because again I've written about that, sort of had some influence on this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the kind of themes that you picked up, the various worlds, as we've discussed here, I mean, you picked on several aspects, the political aspect, the cultural aspect. I was quite interested in the fact that you picked on science as well. Science was very prominent within this, and you flagged that quite early on in the introduction. Was that a particular interest to you? Is that a field that you have particular affinity with, or interest, or why did science come up as one of the prominent worlds that you wanted to look at?
I think Conan Doyle was a scientist. I mean, he was a doctor, but you can call that a scientist. And Sherlock Holmes was too. I mean, we first meet Sherlock Holmes in his laboratory, and there's a very strong similarity there between the training, if you like, of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. It's often said, how Conan Doyle drew on his tutor at Edinburgh University, Joseph Bell, for the way that Sherlock Holmes looked at the case. It was similar to the medical examination conducted by Dr. Joseph Bell in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary when Conan Doyle was his sort of assistant. He was still at university. But the point really is that, that was something that I'd flagged up back in my biography, that, Conan Doyle's sort of scientific background was very important, the way that, he had been at Edinburgh University, which had a sort of tradition of empirical examination of things. And Conan Doyle picked that up and sort of ran with it. Of course, he didn't go on to be in any way a scientist, but it's established, it's well known that when he was a student, he used to do sort of experiments on himself with plant alkaloids and things like that. Which quite sort of dangerous in some ways. And Now, as far as Conan Doyle and indeed Sherlock Holmes and science is concerned, this was very much part of my remit. The book itself was something that a publisher came to me and asked me to do, so It wasn't exactly my idea. But I was very much, it was something that I really was excited about, because it was something I wanted to re-examine. I hadn't really written very much about Conan Doyle, and even less about Sherlock Holmes. So my feeling is that both Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle are about sort of finding out about things. And the word that I particularly used actually was questing. They were all both on quests. And I tried to incorporate that into all the things that I focused on, such as science. And of course, technology was coming into becoming important. And both Conan Doyle initially and then Sherlock Holmes sort of reflected this. It was also, just to finish that, it was also the period of expansion geographically and politically. And that was something that I wanted to get in describing the worlds of Sherlock Holmes. That it was, it was the period of imperialism, and I do sort of examine that. And Conan Doyle was definitely an imperialist, but he was what was described as a liberal imperialist. That's sort of things that I go into in my my book, which is, I look into the way that Conan Doyle, having been basically of Irish extraction on both sides of his family, was sort of interested in the Irish question, and his positions on home rule, for example. He was initially very against Fenianism. He was against any kind of sense of revolutionary activity, but then he came round, and that again is sort of an interesting part of the story, because he came round through his friendship with Roger Casement, who was a British diplomat who'd investigated crimes of slavery, basically in the Congo, and Conan Doyle had picked this up and had written about it, and he was incensed about this, and he then kept up with Casement, who contributed to books of his in one way or another, such as The Lost World, and then when Casement became very sort of determined in his Irish republicanism and became a revolutionary, Conan Doyle didn't, took issue with him on that. But when Casement was arrested for treason, Conan Doyle supported him basically, and he kind of lobbied against the execution of Roger Casement.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you find that this is one of the most fascinating aspects about Doyle? I've said this before. I find so many people are so willing to just put him in a box. He's the big 6-footer with the big moustache. He looks like imperialism personified, and he's enormously complex. And what you just described with Casement is a case in point. And this complexity. Do you feel, having done this book as a comparison in a way of Doyle and Holmes, that this complexity then goes across into Holmes, and that in a way Doyle can use his fictional character to do that?
I definitely think that, yes. It's quite difficult to explain in some ways, but the fact that Conan Doyle was this complex character with differing opinions and differing approaches, and ones that changed as well. He was also, sort of paradoxically, but not exactly, immutable. He was very much that solid man that you described, but he was remarkably open to other points of view, I suppose it's true to say. And this certainly transferred to Sherlock Holmes. In a way, Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective, his business was about sort of being open to various possibilities about outcomes for cases that he was involved in, and it calls for a lot of empathy, which and obviously knowledge of the world, which Conan Doyle definitely had.
Yeah, what we see in this period generally is a whole series of changes coming rapidly on top of one another. Technological, political, social, cultural, to go back to your point about 1895, it's interesting that in a way, Sherlock Holmes almost gets pickled in aspic in the middle of this. The stories are written late into the 1920s, but actually Sherlock Holmes's existence sort of ends around about 1903. Yes, we get his last bow and the lion's mane, but mostly he's kind of at that right at the turn of the century.
I understand what you're saying, and there is an answer to that. I'm not sure if it's sort of rather a pat answer, but it is that Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes in 1893, and never quite sort of resurrected his interest in the character after that. This is something that I'm still sort of playing with, if you like, because I think there are some very interesting stories later in the canon, and I feel that perhaps there will be room for sort of reinterpretation of some of those later stories over the years. But that would be my sort of answer to that.
I think this is a good point to come in with this idea of Conan Doyle as contributor to his period. Up to now, or up to the past 20, 30 years, being sort of in the background and overshadowed by Sherlock Holmes. But the more you look into him now, you can see he really was at the centre of so much of what was going on in his period, that he almost can now be seen as an exemplar and a figure on whom to put lots of hooks almost to study the period.
Well, obviously, I think that Conan Doyle was pretty important because that was my point of entry as Conan Doyle's biographer. But yes, I think that Conan Doyle was a significant figure. He had interests. He was very well connected. But it wasn't as though he was sort of dined every night with the Prime Minister or anything like that. But he was a club man. He was very sociable, And so, he was very much in tune with his times, if you like. And from that point of view, he's very interesting. He's also a man who had so many interests and so many sort of aspects to him that it makes him, a sort of doubly interesting, or whatever you might say. But in the sense that, he was a writer, obviously, and, a very good one. He trained as a doctor, so he knew about his science and his medicine. And, he was interested in the wider world. Well, I think I've dealt with that one. But, other things such as he was interested in, this is the subject of, it's a sort of minor part of my book that we're discussing, but he was interested in sport, he was interested in the arts, and if you want to ask to what extent was Conan Doyle important in the world, and what influence did he have? Well, obviously Sherlock Holmes, that was his main influence. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think everybody knew Conan Doyle. He was a man of great influence and greatly respected. I think that somehow or other, you get into the sort of 20th century and definitely into the war years, and his influence begins to wane. And, this, he wants to write the history of the Great War, and there's somebody else there to do it, in fact. And then, of course, it brings into play the fact that he became obsessed. I think I'll stick with that word, with spiritualism. And he's still a sort of well-respected figure, but he just doesn't, people don't really consider him to be at the forefront of sort of intellectual life or anything like that. Which, in a way, obviously, if you're a spiritualist, you think differently, but in the general kind of aspect of things. And one of the interesting things, just struck me then, he was very much the masculine imperialist, etc. But there are aspects of, he did manage to reflect in a funny kind of way that sort of unease that began to develop in the sort of last decade of the 19th century, that the politics weren't going to work out exactly as there was tensions. The British Empire wasn't going to be sort of have everything running before it. There was the Boer War, etc. And so Conan Doyle did somehow manage to reflect that. And it was then that was the era of, the certainties of the Victorian era were just beginning to be questioned by people like Freud and people in physics. Now, you don't find that coming out kind of exactly in Conan Doyle or in Sherlock Holmes, but you do get it reflected in, I would like to argue, in Sherlock Holmes's bohemianism.
Yes, definitely.
And, also you could almost put it, the fact that Sherlock Holmes, as a partaker of the drug cocaine, he wasn't a stereotype character. And actually that is my answer. Both Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and in fact you did refer to this earlier, are characters with different aspects to their natures, lead to their enduring qualities, their enduring sort of aspect in history, as it were.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think also there's something there in what you say about, the fact that you have this rapid period of change. There is this sort of dislocation happening for people towards the end of the 19th century. And I've always wondered if that's maybe why Conan Doyle always placed Sherlock Holmes in this time period. That actually Sherlock Holmes is both a bohemian figure, which gives you the sort of flexibility to explore some of these changes, but you also pickle him in aspic in 1895 in that he's never going to change that much beyond it. Even Sherlock Holmes in 1927 looks like he did in 1900.
Correct.
It's that kind of thing. But
that's right.
I wondered also, when you came to looking at the sort of parallel lives of Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes as you do in the Worlds of Sherlock Holmes, were there any sort of synergies or connections that particularly surprised you with the things that you discovered in the course of writing the book that you maybe hadn't appreciated before?
I suppose one of the surprising things was, in a way, how despite being similar in so many ways, Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes were so different in other ways.
Yes.
And you've got Conan Doyle, the sporting figure, and interesting, and Sherlock Holmes, this person who actually would, in many respects, prefer to be sort of in his rooms in Baker Street. But having said that, again, I look into this in my book that Sherlock Holmes had his sporting interests, and I look into them. I think there's even a chapter devoted to them.
There is
kind of again the sort of correspondence, the kind of parallels with Conan Doyle. So that just gets back to the complexity and of the whole story, which makes it interesting.
Yeah,
it wasn't exactly surprising, but it was surprising in a sense that how interesting it was, and how fascinated I was with Sherlock Holmes, and particularly this interrelation with him and Conan Doyle, which somehow or other, again going back to something that I said, has somewhat been skirted over. I mean, would you agree? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
No.
I think it's been a recurring theme of ours on the podcast that where do you?
Well, that's what I would have thought.
Where do you bring him out from the shadow of Sherlock Holmes?
It is interesting what we're saying there with your approach to this book and a kind of knowing less about Sherlock Holmes. It's kind of the opposite approach to most previous Doyle biographers who've been brought in through Sherlock Holmes and used that as the basis, whereas you've gone the other way and come from the Doyle aspect and as
Very
you say,
true.
through Kipling and that world that Doyle inhabited. And the Sherlock Holmes is actually on the fringes of that rather than at the centre, which is a totally different approach to most of your predecessors.
Well, I mean, that's certainly I would not disagree with that. Judgment definitely. So, I mean, I hope that doesn't mean that, I kind of, I mean, I'm aware that the world of Sherlockians, it's quite precise, and people very much sort of look into, they remember things, what exactly happened in this story, and I'm getting in that direction, but I haven't quite reached it yet. I think.
In that sort of respect, I think it is particularly fascinating as well that you're also biographer Ian Fleming. And another writer who was taken over by his creation in many ways. And did you find any sort of, as you delve more into Sherlock Holmes and Doyle, did you find any degrees of parallel there between Fleming and Bond and Holmes and Doyle? And was Fleming influenced in his creation of Bond by Doyle and Holmes in any way?
Just to deal with the latter, I can't honestly say that Fleming was influenced by Holmes. I mean, I have written about other people, and you've mentioned my other biographies, that you do see. I mean, for example, I wrote about Kipling. There are instances where Conan Doyle and Kipling kind of work together almost, and and also I wrote a book about Wilkie Collins, the earlier Victorian novelist, and definitely Wilkie Collins's efforts at wide-ranging novelist again, but he wrote The Moonstone, and his sort of work, which features a very prominent detective, and so the point really is that I think Conan Doyle did read, although he didn't actually necessarily, I don't remember him referring to, but there is evidence of Wilkie Collins's influence in his stories. To get back to Bond, and I mean, again, perhaps a bit of a trite answer, but I hope not, is that, why are we still aware of these characters? Because somehow or other, leave on one side the writings, which in both cases are very good. They were appropriated by people who presented a visual image of of Sherlock Holmes and then of James Bond. And so, actually one of the features of my book is, the importance that I give to the way that sort of popular image of Sherlock Holmes with the pipe and stuff like that, how that was based on the play that was became very popular at the turn of the 19th, 20th century with William Gillette in the main part, and that introduced Sherlock Holmes to a very a much wider range of people, particularly in the United States, but also popular in this. And then, of course, you begin to get the films, which I also look into, and that's part of the Sherlock Holmes story, the films, and the happy coincidence that Sherlock Holmes came at the time of sort of increasing technology, and Conan Doyle particularly was interested in film cameras. He had been a photographer in his early days, and strangely, I think not significant in this context reasons. There weren't that many British or American films of Sherlock Holmes early on, and again, it's interesting that those films came from Germany and Denmark in particular. So the image became important, and obviously, I think it goes without saying that's true of James Bond. Who's now sort of everybody in the world knows James Bond, as indeed everybody in the world knows Sherlock Holmes. But I think that what was it that brought James Bond out of just being another one of the English thriller heroes? I think that somehow or other, and this goes back to another thing that we've said, there was something. I mean, you wouldn't have had that happy coincidence and that way that the films and the kind of the written work sort of work together. You wouldn't have that if the characters themselves weren't sort of made for the genre. The characters themselves weren't sort of sympathetic and just interesting and exciting.
Yeah, there's something about those core characters. We've recently done episodes on both The Final Problem and The Empty House, and Bond came up in both because, of course, Fleming managed to kill off Bond.
Yes, of course,
and bring him back.
Yes, indeed.
But I think it's a very interesting chapter in the book about the sort of media representations of Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes now is sort of, well, famously now is public property, as it were, and you get now a sort of proliferation of different interpretations of Sherlock Holmes, which each in their own way keeps Sherlock Holmes alive, brings people back eventually to 1895, actually, I think. But
yes,
interesting, it hasn't quite happened that same way with Bond yet, but maybe we're still within the copyright window on Bond.
Well, that's you put your finger absolutely on it. Yes, indeed. Yeah, I mean, he's in copyright both in the literary Bond and the film Bond. So and run by you know, particularly, I suppose, in the film sense, that they are very sort of, they guard their property quite closely.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. Yes. Another aspect of the kind of continuation of the life of Sherlock Holmes that you discuss in the book is actually fandom and how the character is taken forward by enthusiasts around the world. So what drew you to that part of the story? Why did you want to include a chapter on the sort of fan afterlife?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say something about the way that Sherlock Holmes has endured, and I thought that the story of the way that Sherlock Holmes has been studied initially, and the way that he was taken up, and the setting up of societies that kind of perpetuated his memory, if you like, and studied him, was significant, and that also led to the proliferation of interest in him around the world. Obviously, there are parallels there with Fleming and James Bond, because there are a wide range of societies and stuff. It was something that I suppose I wanted to inform myself about it to an extent. That is always a good reason to do a bit of writing.
Absolutely.
You want to find out about something, and actually, I suppose I have to admit, I didn't know too much about the aspects of fanfic and stuff like that. That I subsequently, found not just that, interesting examples of it, but there was a whole kind of area of study, with it's almost sort of academic in its way that it is now approached, and that is of great interest.
Well, and circling back to, I think, something that you said at the beginning, or a question you posed at the beginning about Conan Doyle's place in the mix, as it were, and I think we have seen in recent years, probably in the last 10 years particularly, Conan Doyle start to come a bit more into the story, including societies that will not just talk about Sherlock Holmes, but also talk about aspects of Conan Doyle's life and work. And I think also we've really seen that very recently in the academic field as well. So fingers crossed, we get to see Conan Doyle from the shadow of Sherlock Holmes, while also because actually it enables us to understand the Sherlock Holmes stories that much more by appreciating his life and work, which is, I think, what you're really doing here in this book.
You're absolutely right. I would, you put it much better than I put it. So thank you very much. It's really, yes, in order to understand the Sherlock Holmes stories, to understand Conan Doyle is very important. And I mean, I think that people haven't really, I mean, it's not as though people have sort of failed to do that, but to really kind of make a thing of it, and and to kind of say there are very interesting parallels is worthwhile.
Yeah, absolutely.
And sort of related to this, and certainly with the fanfic and the copyright issues and so on, going back a bit more probably, but do you, and again as a biographer of Doyle as well, think that there was a lot of damage done to Doyle's latter-day reputation by the behaviour in particular? I'm thinking of Adrian and Dennis Conan Doyle.
Yeah, let's just say that it's part of the story, in the sense that estates, sort of their management of them, go through various evolving patterns, if you like, and clearly Adrian Conan Doyle and his brother Dennis, they had quite a high-handed attitude to their role in perpetuating their father's memory. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we've now got over that, and we can sort of look at it in a sort of historical way, something, and I mean, I think almost It's not my favourite character by any means, but I think that we might begin to examine Adrian a bit more.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, and the way that his relationship with John Dickens Carr and that sort of thing. It's all part of the story, if you like. I didn't deal with that.
In the book, the Worlds of Sherlock Holmes, there's an absolutely beautiful photograph of Adrian and John Dickson Carr together, which is a very expressive picture. I think it's just wonderful.
Right. Well, that's part of the story. It's interesting that there is such a lot of interesting material. I mean, you as podcasters have looked at Conan Doyle outside the canon, and obviously, I think that people will begin to be interested in the Challenger stories more and things like that. Which, they do reflect aspects of Conan Doyle because they kind of hark back in a way to his time at Edinburgh with the various characters and stuff like that. But his interest in science, his interest in the wider world, the lost world, and then of course you get his spiritualism coming into the later stories in the way that it is not
in the Sherlock Holmes.
It's not in the Sherlock Holmes stories, exactly.
That's right. Yes, he's an interesting case in point, isn't he? And that Conan Doyle felt he could bring his spiritualism to bear with Challenger, but he couldn't really do it with Sherlock Holmes.
No, that's an interesting story. I mean, why not? Or to what extent is there some aspects of the paranormal in the later stories?
Yeah, absolutely.
Etc.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Well, Andrew, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've really enjoyed talking to you about it, and all the very best for the book. We wish you every success with it, and everybody can get it now, I think, at all good bookshops, as they say.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much, and I've very much enjoyed it too. And it's been good to sort of talk to a couple of people who sort of really know the how Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes sort of live in a world together, and they you must kind of take cognizance of both of them in order to understand the whole phenomenon, if you like.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
All the best.
Well, that was really interesting to talk to Andrew, and we thank him again for coming onto the podcast. And I was really taken by the fact that one of the key points of writing this book was to infuse into our reading of Sherlock Holmes an understanding of Doyle and Doyle's world, and how that can ultimately enrich our understanding of the Sherlock Holmes stories that we love and enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a totally valid and well, increasingly valid perspective. Now, there's still plenty of room for the Sherlockian game if people want to play that. But there is this growth of interest in Doyle as we've noted, and you can enjoy the Sherlock Holmes stories without Doyle perfectly well. That's not a problem. But you bring Doyle into the mix, you actually it enriches it. It enriches your understanding, both of the writing of the stories themselves and what's informing the stories, and also the world in which the stories are set and the world in which they were written. So I think you to get full benefit, you do have to take that approach, and it does seem to be increasingly being taken without pushing the game entirely out of the way, as I say, for those who want to play it. But there's definitely a shift in the ground these days.
Yes, and I think Andrew's book is another milestone along that journey that we're on at this point in time. So that wraps it up for this episode of the podcast. You can find the show notes at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're interested in sponsoring or supporting the podcast, then check out the website where you can find out how you can become a sponsor through Patreon or PayPal, or please leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice. So, Paul, what are we going to be looking at on the next episode?
Next episode, we're actually going to go right back to the earliest existing Conan Doyle story, The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, which was written in the 1870s lay forgotten in the Blackwoods archive for decades and was finally published in 2000. And it's absolutely fascinating to go back to study this story and see where it all started.
Yeah, absolutely. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Not going to start up on that wretched fiddle again, are you? Oh, we're in for one of those sessions, are we?
Precisely. Let me detain you, Watson. I expect this will be a four-pipe problem at the very least.
Yeah. Well, take care you don't set the upholstery afire the way you did that night at Aspet de la Souche.